discussion to really get us kicked off.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And thanks to the colleges of the Fenway and to Emmanuel College for hosting us here this afternoon. My name is Josh Luckens, and I am an instructional designer at the Wentworth Institute of Technology. Delighted to be here, and I also serve on the Colleges of the Fenway's AI think tank. Delighted to see so many AI think tank members here, and also thanks to those of us joining on Zoom. Big welcome to everyone, not only on Zoom and here, but also if you're watching the recording in the future. Thanks for doing so, and feel free to reach out to us. We'd love to kind of continue the conversation beyond this afternoon. Delighted to have such an illustrious and diverse panel of faculty, staff, and students from across the colleges of the Fenway. In a moment, I will invite them to introduce themselves, go down the line. But really briefly, just wanted to frame the discussion with a quick definition of what we're talking about when we say generative artificial intelligence. So I asked this afternoon, I asked Google's Gemini, one of the big AI tools, to define what is generative artificial intelligence? And this is what it told me. It said generative artificial intelligence is a type of AI that can create new content. So that's distinct from AI that can't create new content, like your spell check, which is just noticing, okay, that's wrong, it might be this. Generative AI can actually create new things. And like Gemini says, text, images, videos, music, and code. That's a lot of things. A lot of things that humans have been creating and continue to create. But if these tools can do so, that changes things, right? Especially for our higher education classroom. So that's going to be the focus of today's talk. Today's panel is how this is affecting higher education and academics, and what are some of the pros and cons, and what are some challenges and opportunities that we see both now and going forward. Something else about generative AI is that it uses large language models, large AI models called foundational models, taking in tons of data, lots of input to learn how to create new content. So that's an amazing thing, but also there's all sorts of issues that go into that, pros and cons as well. And Gemini was kind enough to let me know that while generative AI can produce creative results, the outputs are not always accurate or appropriate. So, thanks for being so honest, Gemini, and for your metacognition. Although it must be said that the only metacognition happening is with us, because we are humans and we are able to step back and think critically and analytically about what's going on. Generative AI is really just predicting very accurately sometimes, and less accurately other times, what humans would do, and kind of remixing the knowledge that is already out there in the world. And sometimes it's quite miraculous what it's able to come up with, but there's all sorts of problems that we'll address as well: ethics, environmental problems, biases, etc. So we're just going to go down our panel, starting with Julia and going to the end. Everyone will have a chance to share your name, what university you're affiliated with, your academic discipline, and what you're up to at that institution, and just your hot take on generative AI in higher education. What brings you to the panel, and what perspective you're sharing with us this afternoon. Julia, take it away.
Hi, everybody. My name is Julia Crane Dempsey. I use she, her pronouns. I'm from MassArt. I'm the director of annual giving there. So I'm a staff member in the fundraising department. I work on mass communication campaigns that go out to our donors, as well as developing one-to-one relationships with individual donors. And I really like AI. I think it's really exciting. And my focus on how I've integrated it into my work and my life is how can we use it to be more efficient and work smarter, not harder type of thing, but also keep humanity and connection at the center of our work, especially my work that's so focused on relationship building.
Hi, my name is Rick Trilling. I'm from Wentworth Institute of Technology. I am a cybersecurity management professor. And my hot take is really about whether people actually know what AI is. And I promise this is not going to suddenly go into a half-hour takeover this, but about 2 minutes. If you picture like a series of concentric circles coming in a sort of Venn diagram, there's AI, artificial intelligence, there's machine learning, there's deep learning, and there's neural networks all contained within that. And AI is, if I may, like your Mr. Coffee machine. You can program it to do certain specific steps, and that's all it does. And then machine learning is that coffee machine learns after a while that you have for the last 30 days asked for dark roast 80% of the time. So on the 30th day, it's going to ask you, would you rather I just did dark roast? Deep learning is going to be the computer beginning to make its own connections, ask its own questions. And neural networks, the holy grail, is that you'll have something like we've been searching for about 50 years, since Danny Ellison was doing this in Cambridge and Thinking Machines, trying to create neural networks, computers that replicate the human brain. Generative AI, to me, is an offshoot that is as valuable to us as Google, and I would never tell my students not to use it. They just have to cite it.
Hello, my name is Michael Clinton. I am a computer science student at Wentworth, where they focus in artificial intelligence in my studies. Most of my experience using AI has been non-generative AI. I've been using it. I do a lot of game development work, and a lot of programs like on the Unreal 5 engine uses a lot of artificial intelligence and lighting and other things for like building a game world. But since I am going into artificial intelligence, I do have a very strong take that it should be used more often in classrooms, especially for like programming. What it is a tool that sort of increases efficiency. And there's a lot of like, there is one worry that like newer students who don't know how to program yet are using it as a way to not learn and to just sort of replace, like do the work for them. But I think that the students that use tools that way, I don't think the students that use tools in a good way should be punished for like not unable to use these tools because of certain students using them in a certain way. And I think it's very important that we learn to use the tools that we have. We learn to use this next generation of like, this helps me program this or this or this. I don't have to do all the grunt work. I can just sort of form my project as a whole, and I can like go and fine tune things where I need to be. It's sort of my main take.
Hi, I'm Juniper. I use she, they pronouns. I am a grad student over at Simmons, studying library and information science. I have so many hot takes for AI. Kind of actually the opposite of what y'all have been saying. I don't think it should be used as much. I think it has applications certainly in things like programming and classroom applications, but a lot of my work in my undergrad at Case Western was dealing with NLP bias, and bias in generative models, specifically in large language models. And I think just that right now, especially in my field of library science, like it's going to impact how we get data and how we use that data in a lot of ways that I don't think are really apparent right now. So my stance is a lot more cautious than y'all's, but it should be used, I think, to some extent.
Hi, my name is Yunxin Li. I'm a faculty member at Simmons University, and my disciplinary background is history and humanities more generally. I think what brings me to today's panel is that as a humanities scholar, I care deeply about the relationship between machines and humans. So a question I would ask about AI is, in what aspects would AI improve the quality of life for humans in the long run? And in what aspects will it harm our ability to think independently or establish meaningful connections with people and live a happy life? So I've been experimenting using AI in my teaching. I think my general take on this is to keep an open attitude, but to take it step by step, because we are not fully aware of the long-term impacts yet. So I would experiment and then stop and reevaluate before taking the next step. I also think this must be a collective effort taken by scholars and students and administrators in higher education, because one institution's policy would have impact on other institutions' policy. So it must be a collective effort.
Good afternoon. My name is Vish Paradkar, preferred pronouns he, him. I'm a technology enthusiast and I work in the IT division at Wentworth Institute of Technology. The reason I decided to serve on this panel was, I've been part of the AI steering task force at Wentworth Institute of Technology. So I just wanted to share some of our thought processes and initiatives we are planning, and also learn from my co-panelists as well as the audience as to, what questions, comments, suggestions you have. So thanks for being here.
Hi, I'm Jessica Stubman. I am a student at MassArt and I am the student government representative for animation. I am here at this panel because I want to represent artists and also any culture enjoyers as well. And I also want to represent artists on the behalf of the negative and positive effects that generative AI has on us.
Hi everyone, I'm Jessica Parker. I'm a faculty member at MCPHS in the Doctor of Healthcare Administration program. My background is healthcare research, so I previously lived here in Boston and I worked on several large-scale healthcare grants. It's funny, I never thought I was going to conduct my own research again. Like in 2017, I left Boston, I started my own business, and I've continued teaching part-time. But I started using generative AI last year at the same time as many people in the world, and I just felt, I was curious. I was also having an existential crisis at the same time. So depending on what day you ask me, my answer might differ. But what I find most interesting about kind of where I am right now with generative AI, because I think I've published 4 studies on my work with it, either for research use cases or for teaching and learning. And I find myself learning more about us as humans the more I learn about AI. And I find it's like turned me into a bit of a philosopher. And I'm reminded of like Ethan Mullick. He released this Substack last year on the crisis of meaning. And like we place meaning and value on things that take time and effort. And if AI can do many of those things with a click of a button, like what are we now going to find meaningful and valuable as humans? And I find myself thinking about that a lot. And it's kind of come full circle where I'm learning about AI and then I turn and I want to learn about like human cognition because it helps me understand AI more. So my hot take is, I think the fear around AI is warranted, but I think there's an opportunity for us as humans to really think about what we find to be meaningful in our work and our relationships. And it's a time of reflection. So yeah, that's kind of where I am.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. And my name is Xiaowei Zhao. I'm here local at Emmanuel College, and I'm a professor of psychology and neuroscience. And also I'm a certified instructor of deep learning and AI by NVIDIA. So I offer sometimes from time to time, I offer free workshops for college of Fenway students and colleagues. Okay, and so. The question is that we may say, what's the unique perspective that you would like to mention about AI? And I would like to say that for me, AI, I focus on so-called neural network, and that's artificial neural network. And I was very excited this morning. I heard the news that Nobel Prize in Physics goes to AI. And actually, I was trained as a physicist. When I was in graduate school, I was learning things like Hopfield network, which is the guy who won the Nobel Prize, and also Hinton's network, which is kind of very popular now. What I want to say is this field is truly interdisciplinary, and it's kind of coming from physics, from philosophy, Michel Yaguer, so basically. And there are many different names, but the key idea is highly interdisciplinary, and it needs help or maybe contribution from all the field.
Thank you so much. Thanks to all of our panelists for being. Can we get a quick round of applause for our panelists? As you heard, we have an incredible range of panelists representing different disciplines. All of our colleges of the Fenway institutions are represented, and of course, different perspectives on life on the college campus, from staff to faculty to students. So that was one of our aims with the AI panel, the AI think tank, putting together a panel where there would be dialogue and discourse between folks who wouldn't ordinarily get a chance to speak with one another and share really different vantage points on this transformative technology. So what we're gonna do now is we have a series of 7 questions that the AI think tank has put together. And we're gonna ask those to a couple of our panelists who volunteered to speak on that question. And then there'll be time for one other probably panelist to offer a thought if there is something that anyone wants to add. After that, there will be time for questions from the audience, both our live audience and our Zoom audience. So feel free to make any notes of questions that you want to ask. And I believe that for the Zoom audience, we're asking you to use the Q&A feature on your Zoom rather than the chat for questions. And feel free to leave those in the Q&A feature at any time. So our first question is from your, for our first question, we're gonna go to Xiaowei and then to Jessica Parker. And that question is, from your experience in your work as a student or educator, what is the greatest contribution to your work with the rise of AI and the greatest drawback?
Okay, I would start. I had experience in both AI, artificial neural networks, both as a student and as an educator. And I started learning artificial neural network back 25 years ago, back to grad school. And so I have kind of mixed feeling about the contribution of AI into this area and also drawback in this area. So first, I feel that AI is definitely a good thing, and it brings, if we may call it, democratize the field. And when I first began to study and work on this area, and the neural network is kind of in the low tide at that time, 1998 or so. And so we are a small group of people just working on things like physics, a little bit on computation modeling or in psychology, this area, not too much. And I'm very happy to see now with generative AI, this tool has been used in many different areas. Actually, now I'm working with my colleagues at business school using some kind of natural language processing tools to analyze Twitter information, and that cannot be done many years ago. Okay, so that's a good thing, but I feel the greatest drawback is now many people use AI tools as a black box and never understand how to use it, what's really the working principle of these tools, and just use it on whatever they can get, and there might be lacking the guardrail for to interpret their results and so on and so forth. So that's my biggest concern. I feel drawback of this kind of popular use of AI, and that's why I would like to educate people and to offer workshops on AI and things. So because I believe when you use it, you have to have a deep understanding of it. That's my takeaway.
I'd say the greatest contribution to my work reflects the interdisciplinary nature of AI. I now find myself on any given day working with linguists, machine learning engineers, studying linguistic markers, talking to computer scientists. And that's because generative AI really blurs the boundaries between technical and non-technical. Suddenly, I'm able to create a corpus of all 22,000 of my chats with ChatGPT and study it alongside a linguist. And those are things I couldn't do before. I can write Python code and run a program on my local map terminal. Those are things I would have had to hire someone to do before. So the nature of my research is really expanding, and it's allowing me to learn from a lot of different people in ways that I don't think I would be. But on the drawback side, I think about what it means for our expert pipeline, and now the ability to produce, like I think it's just about text production. So generative AI, if you use ChatGPT, especially the more advanced premium models, the texts that they produce are very precise and accurate on the surface, but a lot of times they lack depth. And that can cause problems for someone who's learning, who's not an expert. And so I do worry about what this means for developing experts in our field.
Thank you. Does anyone else on our panel feel like speaking to this question? Well, we'll have plenty of chance to hear from everyone as we go on. So our next question is, what are your concerns, and this is gonna be for Michael Clinton and Vish. What are your concerns about how generative AI is used or not used at your school department or in your classroom?
Yeah, so as I said before, I think generative AI, for students at least, is more of a tool than anything else, especially for computer science. And I think I've been a bit lucky in my classes personally. One of my network programming class, we're actually encouraged to use generative AI a lot in class. If the professor doesn't understand or doesn't like know a specific question that a student asks, he'll tell the whole class, like, oh, everyone go ask ChatGPT, go look this up, go see if what generative AI will tell you about this question. And I think that's a very good thing, and I'm slightly concerned about the lack of use of generative AI in some classes. And I think a lot of computer science professors and like programming professors are sort of on that similar side of they encourage the use of this tool. But there is obviously a concern for students using it to not learn, like as I was talking about in my introduction, where I do know there are plenty of people who are going to say, okay, write this program for me. This is my homework. How would I do this? And then just copy and paste that over. That's not how you learn. But once it's understood, I think it is very good for teachers to actually encourage the use of artificial intelligence. Obviously, state when it's used, like don't lie, say this is all my work, don't, nothing like that. But when it's used, I think Harvard actually has a saying, like my teacher brought up one time, that it was something like I can do this work and artificial intelligence can do this work. But when you combine like the speed and efficiency of the artificial intelligence with your own thought and your own like programming and your own work, you actually can build to something a bit greater. You can do work a lot faster. You can do a lot more. Like you get a lot more accomplished. So I think teachers, especially in programming classes at least, should encourage the use of this with some restrictions.
Josh, as many of you know, ChatGPT took something like 4 or 7 days to reach the 100 million subscriber level. And just to put it in context, it took months or years for other companies like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram to reach that 100 million subscriber mark. And what that underscores is the extremely rapid, narrow and steep adoption curve, right? The generative AI is just in the last 18 months being used widely. Many corporations are already thinking about imbibing it in their day-to-day use. And so as the institutes of higher learning, we need to prepare our students to be able to use AI as they go enter the workforce of tomorrow. So some of the concerns I have, and this is not just limited to Wentworth, but in general, higher education has not been the first adopter or a fast adopter for many new technologies of the past, whether it was Wi-Fi, mobile apps, email in the cloud. We've been kind of late to adopting some of the newer technologies. And to some of the points Michael and other students just made, I think this is one area where we need to be thoughtful, but we need to be swift in how we adopt it in academic, non-academic, administrative, and other areas of our campus. The second area of concern, and again, because this is such a new technology, there is a wide spectrum of reactions in the public. Some are kind of bought into the hype or of what AI can do, whereas on the other end of the spectrum, there are people who want to resist or ignore AI. And so my suggestion to my team, my university community is we need to approach AI with urgency, with curiosity, and with caution. The third area, and this goes to my comment about caution, is with some of the new commercially available generative AI tools, it is so easy to overshare and compromise or lead to some of the sensitive data, private data that belongs to you, or data that you may have access to on behalf of your institution. And so, be aware of how the data is used, where it is stored, who will have access to it. Make yourself familiar with your institute's data policies, privacy policies, and ask questions. I think, as you look at various tools to incorporate in your teaching, learning, and other experiences on the campus, it's important that you have a clear understanding of how the institute's data is used. The last thing, and some of our panelists addressed that at the very beginning is, some of these generative AI tools are effective in creating new content, but they can also help perpetuate biases, especially if the training data that was used to train these learning models, if they contain biases, but it doesn't mean we should not deploy these tools. What we need is kind of a human being who is part of reinforcement learning to make sure we suppress and eliminate those biases from the outcomes of the tool. Thank you, Josh.
You're welcome. Is there anybody else on the panel that would like to speak to this question about concerns that you have about the impact of generative AI in your classrooms or in whatever you're working on at your university?
Sure.
Yeah.
I can speak on this more from the perspective of like library science, because in our field, like it's talked about like every day over at Simmons, like what's AI going to do to libraries, like what's AI going to do to the future of technology. I think really big concern about how generative AI is used specifically in our discipline is a copyright issue, right? A lot of things that AI is using to build these corpora of images or text or whatever, a lot of it isn't public domain material. Like a lot of it is, which is really good. I've worked with a few models that have used public domain material like poetry, which has been great. But a lot of the stuff currently is just taking random pieces of data from the internet and creating these corpora that have things like biases in them, obviously, but also other things that aren't the express intention of the artist or creator to put in their work. So I feel like an issue that isn't talked about a ton on like the programming side of things, but more on like the ethics and information science side of things is this copyright issue. Like how are we going to design these very useful tools, but ones that adhere to certain ethical guidelines that are guided by things like copyright, Creative Commons, intellectual freedom, all these things.
Thank you. I think we have time. If somebody else wants to speak to this question, I think we have time if one other person would like to. The floor is open.
Yeah, for this copyright issue, I want maybe people can search for the so-called trustworthy AI. There is a huge topic in this area, and there are a lot of companies, and they are trying to make their generative AI products trustworthy, which means you can trace the source of the image or whatever they put into their generative AI product. So. That's some discussion in this area I know about trustworthy AI.
So speaking of trust, one of the big issues that we see talked about in a lot of the teaching and learning forums is about academic honesty and the ways that generative AI allows people to potentially offload their own cognition to a tool that is able to create and generate work. And it's unclear whether the student is actually meeting a learning objective, especially if it's indirectly assessed. So for example, if I was a basketball coach coaching somebody to shoot free throws, I'm directly watching them coach a free throw and I go, oh, move your elbow this way, move it that way, see how that, but if the learning objective is you'll be able to, analyze a business case or whatever it might be, and I ask them to write a paper, well, maybe they went and analyzed the business case and wrote the paper, but it's kind of an indirect form of assessment because maybe they paid their friend to do it, or maybe they asked ChatGPT to do it. So the question is, how do we know what's really happening and if students are really doing meaningful learning? And this new tool has opened up this whole new can of worms, and some faculty are embracing it and really diving into it. And hey, students, look at it. And hey, before I give you this assignment, I'm going to put this into ChatGPT and see what it can do, and maybe adjust the assignment. And some faculty are like, you're not allowed to touch it, or they're kind of ignoring it. So there's kind of across the spectrum. So we wanted to ask a question of our student panelists. Because oftentimes there's not an honest discourse between faculty and students about what's really going on. So this student question is for our students, Jess, Juniper, and Michael. What's something that you wish your faculty understood about the way you and your peers are using or not using generative AI tools? And what's something that you would really love to ask or tell your professors?
Yeah, I can start. So as an artist myself, I really wish that my faculty understood that not all artists appreciate efficiency. There are a lot of artists out there, especially fine artists like myself, who actually just appreciate the process more than efficiency in general. I think generative AI in the classroom can be beneficial, but there's another thing that I would like professors to know is the use of generative AI to help disabled folks. I am also disabled myself, and I use AI a lot of the times, especially in my liberal arts classes, in order to assist me with reading, writing, thinking, all these other beneficial things. And I don't think it's promoted more, especially in my school. But yeah, I think many of my professors are pushing for efficiency when in reality, there are many students like myself who wish to enjoy the process, enjoy learning and creating with humans and others. I still do believe that generative AI has a place in the classroom, but I think at the moment, for artists especially, I think there's a few ethical issues. And I think also it can kind of undermine student work some of the times. I think also it doesn't allow students to learn and grow at the pace and the capacity that I believe would be improved by human contact instead. Yeah.
Yeah, oh, I agree with like pretty much everything you said. Same thing about that accessibility issue, like a lot of generative tools can be used to like address accessibility issues in the classroom, a lot of analytical tools as well. I think a thing that I wish like as a grad student that my professors knew about AI is that a lot of us to like get to grad school, like we know the ethics of like using AI, especially like as a humanities student now, like we know the ethics of like using AI to like write a paper. But not every student really cares about the ethics. So just understanding that students are going to use it either way. It's more just understanding how they're using it and specifically why, so you can maybe address, like, if it's a knowledge gap issue, then, you know, give them more instruction on that knowledge gap. If it's a thing where they're just feeling uncertain about being in a higher education environment, address that. Like, I feel like there are ways to work around using generative AI in the classroom, but I'm not saying it shouldn't be used. It just has very specific use cases, like accessibility issues.
Yeah, I think I understand like the big dilemma around professors with not wanting students to output their cognition. I thought that was very well said, and wanting to like not let students fall behind by like disabling the tool. And I think one of the best ways to do this in some of the assignments we've had like in school, they incorporate artificial intelligence into like into your work. Like even in my English class, we have assignments or in some of the English classes, there are assignments where the students are actually like writing about AI, and like most of the projects are on, or like in the beginning we're on AI as a way to like get students learning about it, but to make sure they really need to have like their own thoughts. And a lot of other assignments say, yeah, you can use this and this, or you can have assistance with this, but this needs to be on your own. And like it's really like fine tuning like what can you and what can't you use. So it's I think one thing that I'd like for us to understand is I think most students like understand that dilemma of like where they should and shouldn't be using things. And it's really like the more you like, I don't want to say you should leave it entirely up to students to like sort of self-regulate, because that's obviously not going to. College students aren't very responsible, but there needs to be some sort of self-regulation. I don't think you need to have like an overarching control of everything regarding artificial intelligence. There will be some like the students who want to learn will learn.
Thank you. And I see we have some students here in our room, our real room, and in our virtual room. I'm sure there's students as well. So I'd love to invite you during our Q&A time, if there are any thoughts that you have about this question, whether you're here with us or online, to jump in and share those, because I'd love to get some more student voices in the room and really have this be a dialogue and not just a one-way street. So think about that if you have anything you'd like to share. I saw some heads nodding during our panelists, so feel free to jump in our Q&A session and share any of your perspectives on this issue as well. So now we're going to turn over and ask a couple faculty a similar question. We'll start with Rick and then go to Jessica. What are your, and then we'll have room for one other faculty if somebody else wants to share. What are your fears about how generative AI is changing the way your students are learning or not learning? And what would you really love to ask or tell your students?
So I guess I'll paraphrase a line from decades ago. With generative AI, one of the things I have to fear is fear itself. So many people look at AI in general through the media, and they think of AI as Skynet from the Terminator movies. I look at generative AI as much of a vital tool, and again, Michael's been using, other students have been using the phrase tool, as Google when Google first arrived. And for those who've been born since that era, there's no conception of how that radically changed our lives. And the ability of one poor schlub in the middle of nowhere to be able to do research worldwide compared to, oh my God, there used to be things called card catalogs. And there was a journal came out once every 3 months that listed where all the magazines, I'm seeing nods in the room. I'm not gonna rat anybody out. The idea that, so 2 years ago, I sat at Visa's headquarters, Visa, the credit card company's headquarters. And I was in a room, conference room, and it was right off of a room that was about 4 times the size of this room at least. A very, very large room for those who are on Zoom. And it was cubicle after cubicle after cubicle. This was in the cybersecurity function. Cubicle after cubicle after cubicle. The whole room was dark and it was empty. It's like, what gives with this is, this is regular working days. I said, oh no, that used to be 24/7, 365 was staffed by people monitoring network functions and seeing what malware was coming in possibly. Now we have AI taking care of that for us. In the cybersecurity world, AI has been handed over to the defense and the offense. People don't do that anymore. Technologists are not needed for that. AI is a tool for good or ill. It can be used for good things and for evil. That's kind of what you were saying, Michael. I would feel like I was harming my students if my school ever came out and said, students can't use AI, generative AI, because it's too easy for them to just have it do the work for them. Well, my goodness, I mean, Google could have allowed people to do the work for them. Going to the library, taking a book out of the library could allow you to do the work for you if you just didn't cite it properly. From day one, I've had in my syllabus that every student can use generative AI as long as they cite it like they would cite anything else. I am afraid of us missing the boat, us being anybody that is too afraid of generative AI to go forward and use it to its best abilities. The items that have been raised on this panel so far today about inherent bias and other aspects, absolutely true. There are ways to deal with this, which, forgive me, I think Michael already said, and maybe Juniper said. I think that this is a valuable tool that we are only going to see get better and better. And the last thing, because I'm talking too much, I can't wait to. Thomas Friedman in his book, The World is Flat, 2005. What did that mean? It referred to the idea that technology in 2005 had created a level playing field where, again, Schlub in the middle of nowhere could do research that could be valuable to somebody somewhere. With generative AI, I have already begun to use this as an incredibly valuable tool in my research. And I would feel it would be a great sadness and anger if I saw that it was withdrawn from usage. If, as the panelists said, we consider the issues with it and we fix those issues, then this is an incredible tool.
Oh, great. Fears about how Gen AI is changing how my students learn. The fears that I have are not necessarily new, but they've kind of grown or been magnified through the availability of generative AI. And I think it stems from just society with what we reward and value, which tends to be convenience and speed and efficiency. So it doesn't surprise me that we see these companies marketing learning as like learning speed. I remember when Microsoft launched their first educational product, they used that word and it made me cringe because learning is not supposed to be fast. There's supposed to be a lot of friction. Otherwise, you're not learning. If you already know it and you can bypass all that friction, then you're not learning. And so I want my students to know that the point isn't to go faster and be more efficient. Like the whole point of learning is for there to be friction. It's supposed to be a little painful. And so a lot of my students will ask me like, well, where do I draw the line? And the reality is I'm kind of building the plane as I'm flying it. Like I'm learning how to use generative AI in my class. I don't really fully understand the implications of how I'm using it. So when I'm asked those questions, those rules of thumb, those clear boundaries, I can't really answer it. But the way I answer it is a little bit more vaguely. And I just say, well, if you're not slowing down and learning, actually kind of painfully thinking through and reflecting, then you're probably bypassing the learning process. And if you're using generative AI in that way, then you're bypassing the learning process. I'm reminded of, there's a scholar, Sarah Eaton, who's at the University of Calgary. She's really passionate about academic integrity, and she has this framework that she's put out called the post-plagiarism framework. And she talks about how in human hybrid AI writing, we're in this post-plagiarism era. And essentially what she means by that, which caused me to like learn more about plagiarism, I wanted to understand her framework, was that human hybrid AI writing is going to become the norm. It's going to lead to increased creativity, but that the rules of plagiarism no longer apply. And that's really difficult, I think, for us as academics to embrace. An example of this would be like with typical plagiarism, if a student plagiarized, on purpose or inadvertently, there's recourse. Like I can teach them how to go in and take that source and paraphrase it or cite it. But you can't do that with generative AI because it's not an author. It's not responsible for the text that it produces. So these ideas of plagiarism don't work anymore. When I started reminding myself of like why students plagiarize to begin with, because I genuinely feel that if a student plagiarizes, I give them the benefit of the doubt. And when I started learning about plagiarism, looking at the literature on that and Sarah Eaton's work, I was reminded of just some of the issues that we have in our higher education system, which is that we reward the product over the process. And most students plagiarize because they're up against a deadline, they haven't planned ahead, and they're focused on the grade. And so it forces us as educators to like rethink what we are rewarding. And I think if we can shift more to process, then we won't see as much of that temptation to cheat or plagiarize to begin with.
Thank you. Is there anybody else on the panel who would like to speak to this question? So also for those of you in the audience, if you are a faculty member and you have something to share about this, feel free during our question and answer time to share it because we'd love to hear about your concerns about what's going on in your classrooms. And also during our question and answer time, feel free to address questions to individual members of the panel. If you're like, oh, something you said, I want to dig a little deeper into that. Just to build off of what Jessica was saying at the end, there's a great quote by Susan Bloom, who is a scholar of teaching and learning, anthropologist of colleges, who says that if your ultimate goal is getting a good grade, then cheating is possible. But if your ultimate goal is actually learning, cheating is not possible. And as you were saying, Jessica, there's it reminds me of that book, Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. It's like ChatGPT and these types of large language models or generative tools that can put together videos or images or whatever it might be can think very fast. And they will beat you as a human every time in producing something rapidly. But maybe the advantage that you bring as a human is that slow thinking, that kind of really deep reflection, looking at it from a lot of different angles, bringing a lot of perspectives to bear on it and being critical and really being like, what are the implications of this? And we've brought up some of the copyright biases and environmental ramifications of all of these AI tools that are running. So we have a lot of things that we can bring to the conversation beyond, I think, what an AI is capable of. So let's keep our human experience and thought at the forefront in our classrooms and this afternoon. Our next question is for Julia and Juniper, and then one other person, hopefully. This goes into the ethics that I was just raising. So what are the ethical boundaries surrounding the uses of generative AI in the classroom, lab, or studio? And do you have any examples of ethical issues that have come up that you've seen on your campuses?
I can. Okay. Yeah, let's get specific, y'all. So I am currently working on this study. around bio-inspired ANNs for neurological purposes. So like basically taking an animal model and saying, okay, how does this thing work? All right, can you put this into a neural net? Which is really great fun. I think it's really great for students, I'm doing this independently, but it's really great for students to have an opportunity to take a more pedagogical view on AI. However, there are a lot of ethical boundaries. So one that I know of from a research project I got to be involved in down at UNC a couple of years ago is generative AI being used for curriculum design. This can obviously, miss small things that students may be able to like focus in more on if they were to just like give their own input. But I feel like an ethical boundary around designing generative AI for use in like curriculum specifically is that students don't really have an input on how they actually want to learn. It's a large language model that's going to design a curriculum is not going to be responsive to a student's specific needs. So you might be inadvertently like screwing over your own students if you only want to use generative AI to design a curriculum. Now, this isn't like the only example of an ethical boundary, but I think it's the main one that comes to mind for me as someone, hopefully who's going to go into being a professor, doing it higher education eventually, that like students really need to be the ones helping design the curriculums. They need to be responsive to their specific needs. And if you use general AI, you're not soothing your students well, in my opinion.
Really like all your comments. You're very mesmerizing. Yeah, I obviously work outside the classroom in the fundraising office. And so my work, a lot of how I've been using like ChatGPT primarily is writing proposals, writing notes to donors. This person is upset with something that happened and how do I get back to them? And I'm like, is this nice enough? Is this direct enough? Am I using inclusive language? And so while like we all know the information that's like sucked up by ChatGPT to like create the responses that it gives us has inherent biases in it, it's our job, in my opinion, as like humans who are on this journey to implement justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion principles into our work to say, I don't know about that. Will you like, what if you think about this, ChatGPT, would you change your answer? And then I find often like it changes. Something that I think about a lot is how we're using it to create transactional relationships, or rather we should be using it not to make transactional relationships, because the way that we can customize communication en masse is like taking the humanity out of the relationships that we're trying to cultivate in many ways, whether it's like me talking to donors or like companies talking to their customers or anything. If we're trying to customize that scale without, if we're over automating for profits only, it kind of takes the morality out of our work, and the whole reason for fundraising is to try and like help people. So I really have been focused on using it in a mitigated way to like draft things and then make it more customized afterwards. I feel like I'm getting too specific. That's my spiel.
Thank you. Would anyone else on the panel like to speak to some ethical concerns that have come up in your classrooms or labs, studios, spaces of teaching and learning on your campuses? Yeah.
So if you're in academia, you eventually find yourself on 1 or 2 or 20 different search committees. And that's, it's part of life. And search committees are for hiring people. And you're also on committees. There's an admissions office for undergraduate, but for grad students, there's often, ad hoc grad admissions committees as well. And if the word that's used here is ethics or ethical boundaries, we're keeping morality separate from ethics, and ethics being community standards. Everybody knows that you can't go out and just copy something from a book and hand it in as your paper, and if you get busted, you're busted and you're in trouble. It is amazing to me how many people are submitting, students and faculty, looking for admission to programs and for jobs, ChatGPT generated content. And it, at the beginning, was a little bit questionable. Well, are we sure that that's ChatGPT content or not? It was generative AI content. But now we're beginning to have tools that assist us and can absolutely rat out whether somebody's been using generative AI or not. The ethics of using generative AI have not caught up with the ethics of cheating, of copying. And most schools seem not to be wondering so much, what should our rules be, as what are these ethical boundaries? What is everybody else doing? And everybody's looking at everybody else. I think Judy said that before, that everybody's looking at everybody else and trying to figure out, I'm sorry, there was also the idea of, we need to make this a collective effort. There are no boundaries yet, and it's changing too fast for us to have boundaries. But we're going to need to have some of those boundaries pretty soon, even if they're temporary versions.
Right. And feel free to come back to these conversations as we move into our question and answer period. But we have two more questions for the panel that I want to get to before we get there. So this question is going to be for Michael, Julia, and Vish. What are your wildest hopes for how generative AI could transform teaching and learning for the better?
Yeah, I've always had a strong interest in education. In high school, I did a lot of like tutoring and stuff like that. And back then, that was a bit before like generative AI was really there yet. And one of the things I was always interested in was an AI tutoring tool, an AI like assistant, something that would have a lot of information that could say like replace a textbook because it's trained only on like factual information, things like that. That was just all in theory a long time ago. But then you look further at like how people learn and like the human nature and like the idea like how especially younger children, like high school students, learn, and people learn differently. Everyone's very individual. So if an AI or if some generative machine can figure out how you learn, it can also figure out how to best present to you information and how to best teach you things. So it's not like a replacement for teachers. That's not what I'm suggesting. But it's like the idea that like you have a textbook with all this information, like very condensed and all this. Well, some sort of AI tool could also be like a tutoring assistant that can help students and really teach them in the way that they need to learn, like the way that they would learn best. Say if they learn best by like reading something, if they need like certain kinds of examples, or they need certain kinds of practice problems that they really need to like hit the nail on the head in certain one specific area of the subject that they're learning. There's a lot to be done with generative AI for like teaching and learning. And that's not even just within programming, that's just within like sort of the field of analyzing people and analyzing like how people learn. I just found that very interesting.
I loved everything that you were saying, and that's a lot of what I was gonna say too, like, and Joey, I think you said this earlier about democratizing the learning process. And I think there's a lot of teaching and learning that happens in the classroom, but also outside the classroom, whether that's still on campus or just like me at home Googling stuff if I want to learn about it. And the way that generative AI is able to sense like what I need to learn more about. And I know that I'm not bothering it by saying, explain it a different way, explain it a different way, explain it like I'm 5. And it really enables me like as an employee to show up to like meetings or to my colleagues who are content experts with a baseline understanding. So I'm not saying like, oh, please spend your time teaching me like the basics. And then we can work our way up to this complex question that I have. I'm able to do a lot more learning on my own and make the most of like the human to human interactions that I have.
As a technology enthusiast, digital transformation of our campuses is something I deeply care about. And if we could say that one silver lining of the pandemic has been how rapidly it accelerated the use of technology at our campuses. And just right on the heels of the pandemic, we saw the generative AI, the new technology advancement. hit the market, and within a short months now, there are several commercial tools available that are using the generative AI capabilities. So we've heard from other panelists about the use of these tools in the classroom for teaching learning experiences. What I want to do is expand that, and I'm very enthusiastic about how these AI tools can help elevate student experiences beyond the classroom. So some of the AI tools that are using natural language processing, large language modules, they can be deployed to look at disparate sources of information. Many offices have, their own islands of information and in their own formats, and that's oftentimes an extreme struggle for students to get the most accurate information. And so these tools could be now deployed. We are actually looking at some of these tools to deploy on our businesses. But they can be used to provide accurate, concise information that our students can have at their fingertips. So that's one example. I'm just broadening the scope of generative AI to robotics. You've heard there are some campuses in US where they're using robots to deliver food services. And so that's one example, I think, that is getting started in that area. Those, like anything else in technology, those things from the price point standpoint, it's going to become cheaper and more accessible. But that can help us provide services that we have not offered to our students, whether it is self-driving cars that can help students with specific needs and accommodations. So I'm just really enthusiastic about how some of these new tools are now going to translate into commercially available solutions and products.
Thank you. Yeah, and whether we're enthusiastic about it or not, we have seen and will continue to see the ways that technology like generative AI continues to transform our societies, our institutions. So may as well be thinking critically about it. I know at Wentworth that we have co-ops and a lot of other colleges have internships, but there's a lot of relationship between what's going on in classrooms and what's going on in industry. And so those creates the potential for feedback loops where students who've gone into an industry space are able to come back to faculty and say, here in this firm or wherever I was, this company, here's how generative AI is being used, which is different from a year ago because the technology has shifted and been adapted so rapidly. So that's another kind of possibility. And also, going along with wildest hopes, there's also fears, because democratizing knowledge and content creation is great, but also there's a lot of disinformation, misinformation, both malicious actors, but also just all sorts of information out there that may or may not be accurate, or be biased, or have all sorts of implications. So one thing that we definitely want to be thinking about as we go into the next question about forward thinking, what education is going to look like, is just the role of teaching media literacy, because it's not just going into the library and being able to do some research. It's the information. There's more information than any of us could ever digest in a lifetime out there. How do we really take that and be critical about it and understand where it's coming from and understand how to use it effectively? So our last question is going to be for Jessica, Parker, Yunshin, and one other panelist. Given how AI is evolving in education, if you could look ahead for 5 to 10 years, what would the college classroom look like? What changes might you see?
I was just talking about this at lunch, and I was telling Chris that I don't think we know. I feel like anytime I do research on generative AI, I'm not thinking big enough, or maybe like a month later, it can do what I was thinking it couldn't do or testing it for. So I truly don't have a clue, but I'll give you my best guess. I think everyone is going to have access to really high quality education, like personalized learning pathways. I think about just something simple right now that's currently capable. So it's hard for me to imagine what 5 years will look like. If you're an auditory learner, you can now take a research article and it'll, use Notebook LM, which is free, to create a podcast, a really engaging podcast. Whereas maybe you would have never read that article to begin with. So our ability to disseminate knowledge and appeal to different learning styles and different cultural styles as well. I think is fascinating. I think a lot about like augmented and virtual reality. I was just talking to someone last night who created a startup for children's age 8 to 11 who are neurodivergent for textbooks that are augmented reality to help them overcome some of those learning hurdles that they experience. And I find that that's fascinating, and that's happening right now. So what 5 years is going to look like, I honestly have no clue. I have been learning a lot about post-labor economics, which is this idea that we're moving toward a leisurely society where AI is going to basically do everything that we don't want to do, and that's going to open up time for us to, like liberal colleges will come back, this idea of a liberal education, and we'll have a leisurely class, and I think that that's fascinating to think about as well. I think that there's issues with that in terms of what that pathway looks like, but those are the sorts of things I find myself thinking about. But I would wager in anyone making a really hard bet about what education will look like in 5 years. It truly is a guess because this technology is advancing so rapidly.
No, I'm really glad that Jessica brought up virtual reality because I thought about the same thing. I think with the advancement of AI and virtual reality, we might see a change in the classroom space within 5 to 10 years. What I mean by that is we had online and hybrid classes during COVID, and then we are bringing back the physical classroom because many of us didn't feel like online classes were close to actual human interaction. But with more advanced virtual reality technology, in the future, maybe an online class would look much more similar to a physical classroom. So we might see the coming back of online or virtual classrooms. And I also think that might help us create more immersive classroom experiences. I'm thinking of a history classroom in this case. For example, when I teach a historical scene, we might ask AI to recreate that scene for us. And then students will be able to engage with that scene just like gaming. So learning could be much more fun in that way. And then a second change I imagine is that we would be evaluating students very differently from how we evaluate them now. We would be assessing a very different set of skills. So with the wide use of AI technology, it might become less important to evaluate students' abilities to search for information or to simply summarize information. Maybe linguistic skills would become less emphasized because AI is doing a better and better job at translating between languages. But other skills might become even more important for us. For example, we want to evaluate students' ability to evaluate evidence to tell what is accurate from what is inaccurate, and their ability to make independent judgments. So I think our assessment criteria would become very different. And finally, for teachers, I think teachers would be able to use AI to do those automated tasks, for example, tracking attendance or grading, or tracking students' progress. And then that would free up some time for teachers to focus on the more high-level tasks, such as giving deep feedback or mentoring students. So yeah, I think I would have very wide implications for both the students and the instructors.
Thank you. Would anyone else on the panel like to speak to this futurist question? Yeah, go for it, Michael.
Yeah, I had a couple of initial thoughts on this, but then I was thinking 5 to 10 years is a long time, especially for technology. So sort of like the idea of like Moore's law, which at a greater level implies like technology sort of grows exponentially. And it's going to, like you see, just like even the past 5 years, we've been gone so far. The next 5 years is going to be double that, right? And I was just thinking what was said earlier, the idea that like education, it's much more easily accessible, like high quality education would seems like it will become much more easily accessible. The idea of the personalized learning paths, like people can sort of learn a lot of things on their own, and then there's sort of like standardized like classical version of like a classroom with a lot of students and a teacher like lecturing or something like this. That becomes much less useful for certain fields. So obviously doesn't cover every field, but a lot of fields. So I'm curious as to how like institutions are going to adapt to sort of take in the idea that like I can go and learn this subject on my own without without needing to go to a certain college institution. I'm curious how like the sort of the fight for relevancy to like still be used, like to still have there's going to be have to be a strong adaptation to that personalized learning. Because you see in society, a lot of jobs, especially in tech, degrees are becoming less valued. Like they're still very valued, still obviously very highly valued. You're going to be prioritized having one. But if you have a lot of like side projects and things you should prove that you've actually like learned and done all this stuff on your own, you can still get hired into like very high positions. And I feel like that's going to keep heading in that direction with those personalized learning paths. So there is a bit more of an extreme question of like, will there be a college classroom? Or it's like, what will that look like rather? Like, it's not going to be the standard, what we see now.
Absolutely, yeah, and there's been a lot of ink spilled about this topic. I've read a lot of articles in the Chronicle of Higher Education and elsewhere about just the future of higher education itself. And the role that generative AI is playing in that transformation and those questions that are being asked across our society. Thank you so much to all of our panelists for all of your fantastic contributions and thoughts. We'll give them a round of applause. So we're going to transition now into questions and answers, and also just comments, both from our audience and of course our panelists. I noticed people taking notes. So if there's anything you've been, burning, you wanted to share, you wanted to ask another panelist, or you wanted to point out, that would be also most welcome. And also Sarah's going to pull up our Q&A from our Zoom participants. So feel free to throw your questions and comments in Zoom as well, and feel free to have a back channel chat going on as well, kind of parallel conversation on Zoom if you want to do that. I'd love to start out just by inviting any students who are in the room to share any thoughts that you had. I know I had invited students to share your perspectives. So yeah, I see you indicating, and feel free to stand up if you're comfortable, or feel free to sit if not, but speak loudly so that the Zoom can pick you up and share who you are and what you're studying.
My name is Tuba. I'm a sophomore at Simmons University and I'm majoring in computer science. You guys did a great job. First of all, thank you so much. And I'm a personal enthusiastic of AI too. My question is, we talked so much about how students do and what they use, what they don't use, what are the limitations, AI is going to help students. But there are so many cases where students do their own work and they use luxurious words, any word that is bigger than 8 or 9 letters, and the AI detection, it tells that it's plagiarized. And then a lot of students I know, and a lot of stories that I've read on Reddit, the subreddit calls around, they all say that they either got dismissed or they were called in the office, and so it's like sometimes you don't use the AI or you just take points, but it's still like the detection tells like, oh, you did cheating, you did everything not by yourself, you're not worthy of the score, and then you get kicked out of school or dismissed. And what can we do about that?
Totally, yeah, that's a great question. There is a lot of research out there on generative AI detection tools, and a lot of basically pointing to how problematic they are. As you described, they are probabilistic in nature, so they do not constitute proof in any way that there has been cheating. They just are generating, just like large language model, probabilities that are not 100% certain, and they generate both false positives and false negatives. And there's a lot of research to indicate that they're biased against English language learners and contain all sorts of other biases. And as you know, doesn't feel good to be accused of cheating when you're not doing so, and to have those concerns raised. Also, I've spoken to a lot of faculty who are like, yeah, I've been teaching English for 30 years, and in the last couple of years, what I'm seeing from students has really changed. And it's, I don't need a generative AI tool to show me, necessarily there's things that are kind of obvious. They didn't even bother to check it, There's also out there are generative AI basically, if you get something from a large language model like ChatGPT, you can go to a website like Hide My AI and put it through there, and then it would, make the probabilistic thing go down. So there's always, a tool and a counter tool. So we advise faculty not to rely on those, but if you are faculty and you rely on your instincts and you're like, that student, I had them do a sample writing in class on the first day, and then the next day they're handing in something that looks like it's, totally different. Well, there's questions there. So faculty, students, folks on our panel, any thoughts about these issues? Yeah.
I do actually have a couple thoughts. One thing I do, even like when I write, even if I'm not using generative AI, which I'm not 90% of the time, unless I'm like for ideas of things, I still put my own essay through an AI checker just to make sure I'm not going to get a false positive if I turn this in, because I do write like very verbosely. So I do have like a similar concern. I think it's a very common concern among students. And another thing, it's just like an interesting idea is you look at the way that artificial intelligence like trains on it, whatever data it gets, and that's why it writes the way it does. Well, I think like looking into the future a bit, students reading a lot of content drawn from AI may also start to write in a way that sort of reflects what they're reading, like it's like their own sort of training, but like the opposite way. So the way students write actually might start to change to become slightly more aimed that way because the content they're consuming is slightly different. So that's something, it's like not very clear right now, but down the line, that is just an interesting thought I wanted to share.
Definitely, in a similar vein as to how, national television kind of spelled the end of a lot of regional accents because you got more and more, so language is always changing and yeah, all these, have you been, you've written emails and it's suggesting what the next words in the sentence should be. I mean, gosh, I can do my own thinking, but if most people are taking that, then it's going to change the way we write and the way we communicate. So, somebody else wanted to speak to this, go for it.
Yeah, I have sort of two thoughts on this. I think the use of AI detectors or the use of tools to humanize AI written text, I think it's a sign of low AI literacy. And this goes back to, I can't remember who brought it up earlier around like starting to see admissions essays or cover letters written by AI. I feel like given a little time as AI literacy increases, we'll hopefully start to see a bit less of that. What I've learned, and this is part of what I find interesting, my colleague is an applied linguist and she's taught me a lot about language and large language models and corpora and how they work. And what I find really fascinating, so when you look at the studies on AI detectors, they do tend to disproportionately target non-native English speakers. So when you think about the frontier AI models on the market, there's like this framework called the WEIRD framework. They're westernized, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. So they reflect our culture in the US. And so when you have a non-native English speaker, their cultural writing style is probably different. Like in English, we tend to write very direct. In certain languages, they hint around the points, they kind of talk in circles, so they write in circles. And so a large language model is looking at prediction. And it's basically an AI detector is just asking itself, like, is this what I would write? And is it a yes or a no? And then it produces a score. And so if that writing style isn't aligned with that frontier model that data was trained on, that WEIRD framework, then it's going to look at it as different and less predictable. I think the more and more faculty and students can learn that, it's like we'll start to see, less people using those tools.
Thank you so much. Sarah, do you have a question from our virtual audience?
Yeah, I was gonna say, why don't we pick it over here? The first one was actually about the detection model, so we answered that one. This next one, what are the thoughts on the pros of AI use and function in comparison to the cons of its environmental impact?
All right, environmental impact. Anyone on the panel or even in the audience want to speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we're seeing a lot, like you mentioned Moore's law, so also like storage space like doubling more and more. Server farms, really big thing. If you go anywhere out to like Davis, California, I was out there a couple months ago, everywhere, you just go out to the countryside, server farm. And uses all this water and everything from the desert that is simply going to the environment, which is a good thing to do. I feel like we will need to have these, though. It's a necessary evil almost. Like I'm not, of course, advocating for destroying the environment, I promise, but I think we're also going to see more things like server farms in like water resource low areas popping up because we need the storage space to develop AI. So it's either do you fix the storage problem, which we're working on it, or do you just stop making AI? And neither one's really gonna ever happen.
Yeah, of course, sustainability concerns are widespread throughout our entire civilization, and AI is definitely a big contributor to that and will continue to be. So thanks for raising that question from our virtual audience. Let's take one more question from our in-person audience. Question or comment that has come up for you in listening to this panel. Yeah, go for it.
So I'm a student at Emmanuel. I major in developmental psychology. And I have a question because a lot of thinking, especially I think one of the conversation brings up of like think fast and think slow. One of my concerns as a student in psychology is always like we are so highlighted on efficiency. This kind of being accelerated by generated AI. Especially we can make things in one click, it's like super quick. But from a sort of developmental point of view, our development sometimes just goes very slow. And also it's like it intertwined with our learning, human learnings and like all of these aspects. And one of my professor in one of my class, I bring up a metaphor that like map versus like GPS. So it's like originally if you don't have a GPS, you need to go through the road. And even if you are without a map in that case, you still remember that routine. But now we have GPS. I don't need to remember any of the maps, but a lot of people not recognizing any road, even if they go every day, but because they're just following their GPS. I would say GPS is a very like good tools for us. It's just cut down a lot of, efforts for us to remember things, but it also is kind of like stuck in our ability to recognizing directions, or it's like that's sort of like our natural ability. I just wondering like, how would you think of this? Definitely this process has already there and we are like experiencing this change already. And it's like, how do you think of it, especially with like the development of generated AI?
That's a fantastic question. I believe it was Plato who said, writing is going to be the death of memory. And it's true. I don't know any Homeric bards who can recite the Odyssey, off the top of their heads, which is too bad. But also, the book exists in libraries all over the world and has been, be able to be spread in all these other ways. And it's the same thing. I've experienced that in my life, just as you have with the GPS and versus the phone and, the London cabbie who used to know every street now is replaced by an Uber driver who follows an algorithm. So what do y'all think on the panel about how our generative AI might affect human cognition and just the way that we operate as human beings in the world? Let alone, with teaching and learning spaces as a microcosm of that world.
One of the ways let's look back in a time to try and project what's ahead of us. So I grew up when we did not have cars in our house. We used to walk everywhere we needed to go. And then as I grew up, we got bicycles. We didn't have to walk. And then we got cars. That didn't, the car was a convenience, but I didn't forget how to walk. I now walk because I want to walk at my leisure. And so I'm just thinking, yes, we now have the GPS, which gives us the direction, but what could we do with that mental brain power that we are saving from not applying to, figuring the directions out. So I really think human beings are going to put their, whether it's time, their attention, their intellect, they're going to put it to ways that can further advance humanity.
So, yeah, thank you. Let's take another question from our virtual audience.
Excuse me. We have a question from Jessica. What are your thoughts on Notebook LM, which was mentioned by one of our panelists, a product by Google? how do you think it could influence the way students approach studying and learning?
Anyone familiar with that tool or, and if you're not familiar with that tool, are there any generative AI tools that have come out that have influenced the way your students, whether they're your students or your students, or you are a student, has, approached the material or, engaged in learning in your classroom? Yeah.
I've used it briefly. I'm not an expert at it. I find it to be pretty incredible. What the questions that come to mind for me when using that or any of these other tools is around like the mental models that we build when we learn. And what we know through research is that the tools that we use influence the mental models that we build. So for example, if you learn to do math in an Excel spreadsheet and you go to do that formula in the future, we tend to think about that process using the tools that we use to learn how to do it. And what's really, and that's through mirror neurons. So it's really unclear is like, what is going to be the impact of generative AI on those mental models that we build? We don't know yet. There's a big question mark around that. And I think that's for any of these tools that we're using, but Notebook LM is incredible. It's free right now. And a lot of these companies are, vying for market share. So it's free. So TBD on what these tools will cost in the future. I think it's a great resource.
What's so incredible about it? What does it do?
You can instantly create like a podcast from an article. You can pull together, like you could upload, so I'm a researcher, so maybe I have 50 research articles that I'm going to include in a lit review. The old school way would be going through them meticulously. I would build a matrix. Now I've been using generative AI to help me with that, but with Notebook LM, you can upload all of those. You could have a chat conversation with just those PDFs. So you're not relying on the data coming from the AI model itself. And you can analyze them in certain ways and store them in projects. And then you could create an audio podcast from that. And so if you're an auditory learner, if you want to disseminate your project that way, you can easily do that. So I think it appeals to a wide range of learners. It has multimodal features as well.
Great. Well, we have about 5 minutes left, so I'd love to give a chance to, if there's anyone in the audience or any panelists who have anything that they've been, thinking about that they'd like to share as kind of last thoughts as we wrap up our discussion this afternoon about generative AI and its transformational power in higher education.
I do actually. I was having a thought just a minute ago when you were talking about how people they learn to do processes based on the tools that they use to learn those processes. Like if you learn to do math in Excel, you learn like a sort of algorithm you're going to use, like when you think about it. And I remember there was this study a long time ago that collected a bunch of records of how people thought of the human brain over the past century or so. And it always tends to be that humans think of the brain, like the general field of science thinks of the human brain as whatever the most recent technology is. Like there are records from a long time ago as the brain being like an enchanted loom, that's an actual quote, or like a very complex train system, when rails and trains were first coming out. And more recently, it's more like a very complex computer. And now I feel like that I haven't really heard people say, oh yeah, the brain is just some artificial intelligence, because it's more the other way around, right? Artificial intelligence is more trying to replicate a neural network, we're trying to replicate our brain. That's what it is. So that's just sorry, this is something I wanted to share. It just randomly came up and I was listening to that a second ago. But I'm very interested to see how we continue to think of our brains as we start to build brains.
As we start to build brains, that's fascinating. Brains outside of our own brains. And what's going to be freed up and what's going, who's going to win, who's going to lose, and how it's going to change our institutions and what happens in our classrooms. So big questions. Any last thoughts from our audience or from our panelists as we wrap up today's discussion? Or from our virtual audience?
Go to one last question if you want to.
Sure, one last question.
Great. So we have a question from a student on here in a class LIS 5488. What is your response to potential security breaches in AI? Is it a secure thing to have within LAMS?
Security.
I'm in that class, so I kind of want to answer that question. Yeah, we literally talked about that today. And yeah, no, there are a lot of security concerns with like how AI is built, how it's used, how it can be used, not only from like an academic perspective, but also like government perspective. Like you might be only using generative AI to, write an essay, but a government out there is probably using it to like develop a neurotoxin or something. Like everybody has their own uses for AI. And so the security concerns in AI aren't necessarily just with how it's designed, but also like how it's used. So there's a lot of just little moving parts there. I'm not really sure I have a specific answer to that, but yeah, a lot of moving parts. Very scary stuff. Not Skynet, still very scary.
Last not to Rick.
And IT sector, not that particular. And oh my God, one of the concerns is you see the problems with misinformation today. And how about if you could influence Google? Well, Google has taken security concerns very seriously for decades, but AI is brand new. Does OpenAI understand those issues? Does it take it? Do all of these different companies take that into consideration? If I were a country, a nation state that wanted to influence what another country thought about things, I could go in and change that large language model in a way that would generate results that were more favorable to my country or more favorable towards one direction or another. Scary doo-doo.
Well, we're ending on a note of generative AI contains multitudes, just like all of our reality is a powerful tool. It can be used in all the ways. So thank you so much to all of you for being here virtually, in person, and to all of our panelists for sharing your perspectives and your wisdom with us, and just the beginning of a conversation as generative AI continues to transform our world and our institutions. Thanks again.